And the next piece I'll be reading is one of our guiding principles. Today's guiding principle is we are Christian. We follow Jesus' example as a way of life and a way of love. Following Jesus is rooted in our identity as Christians, and we cherish our tradition's sacred book, the Bible, for its spiritual wisdom contained in symbol, metaphor, and history. We also explore other faith traditions and learn from other sacred texts as we seek to answer Jesus' call to love. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Amen. Thank you, Frank. Well, as I said earlier, I am so excited to be with you on this Homecoming Sunday. As we were busy preparing and planning and getting things set up for it, people were asking me different questions. Reverend Jessica, do you remember where we set up this tent last year? Or Jessica, do you remember who brought what? Do you remember how many grills we had? And each time I kept saying, nope, I wasn't here. No, I wasn't here last year. And finally someone says, man, it certainly feels like you've been here a lot longer than a year. And I said, I know, it does, in all the best ways. So, but now I am here experiencing homecoming with all of you and not just sending a video in with my greetings. And so whether this is your first homecoming or your fifth or your 15th, if we are glad that you are here. If you didn't know that it was Homecoming Sunday, you are in for a special treat. Because following worship, we will be headed out to the lawn. We've got games. You might have seen all the tables set up. And if you're like me, I think that they started grilling at about 9:30 this morning. And my stomach has been growling since then. So we had several folks who were here yesterday preparing food all day. If you were one of those, would you raise your hands? I'm looking at some of you right now who were helped in the kitchen to prepare. I think some of them are out there. Sean and Helene, thank you. Alvaro, thank you. Robert, I think they might still be back in the kitchen. So very grateful. And then several of you brought dishes that reminded you of a taste of home. And I know you kind of labeled those and put your story. So I'm excited to see what everyone brought and to taste all of the goodies to break bread together after worship. Another thing about homecoming, as we were talking about it, Alvaro kept saying, what is homecoming? What is this? What do you mean homecoming? And he was here for it last year, but was still a little confused. So I was trying to explain the concept of homecoming to Alvaro, and he's like, people, if they've been traveling and they come back, if they've been away, they're welcome home. And he said, well, what if people haven't been traveling, or if they haven't been away, or if it's their first time here? And I said, those are great questions, because we hope that's true. I was like, we hope every time some people come here, as Martha said, that they feel God's extravagant welcome and that they hopefully might find a place called home. But in trying to explain the concept of homecoming to Alvaro, I went back to my first recollection and experience of homecoming. And that was as a second grader. My mother was a public school teacher, and she taught many ages, but at that time she was teaching at the high school, Oakwood High School in Oakwood, Illinois. Some of you might know where that's at. A very small town in the central part of the state. And she was the sophomore class sponsor. So what that meant is that the week leading up to homecoming, she was responsible for overseeing the assembling of a homecoming float that would then be paraded around downtown and around the football field at halftime. So my family's a little competitive and creative. My dad is a civil engineer, and so you can imagine that we spent quite a few hours at the high school every week working on these homecoming floats. And in second grade, I remember just feeling so cool. All of these sophomore kids were hanging out with me, invited me to help them, and kids who had graduated would come back, other teachers would come and help, and that was the year that Garth Brooks' Friends in Low Places had come out. So we listened to that song on repeat every single night. But what I felt most was a sense of belonging and a sense of acceptance. And maybe your first recollection of homecoming is at a sporting event or high school or college, coming back home, but maybe it's not. I was talking with a guest last week from North Carolina who was here visiting her son, and she said that her earliest memory of homecoming was at her church growing up. They would have a huge homecoming celebration where everybody would come back, much like we're doing today. If they had moved away, they would come and make sure that they could be able to try Aunt Mary's apple pie and Aunt Susie's deviled eggs, and they would feast and they would catch up, and they would find themselves rooted and grounded in love. So I hope that that is what happens today. I hope that through our conversation, through our breaking of bread, that we find ourselves back home, that we find that we belong, that we find that we are rooted and grounded in love. So as I was thinking about what should we talk about for Homecoming Sunday, there's a lot of different things. I thought about our guiding principles. And I thought, what better time, I don't know if there is a better time, to begin a series on our guiding principles, to explore these together. Now, when I started last October, I received a couple of different folders with lots of information, lots of paperwork to sign, lots of passwords to memorize, information about CCSM, information about San Mateo, information about all of you. I had a directory from a few years ago, and I tried to memorize as many faces and names as possible. And I also received a welcome brochure. And on the back of that welcome brochure were our guiding principles. And so I cut the guiding principles off of that brochure, and I hung this up in my office on a bulletin board right above my computer so that I would see those every single day. Because I thought that as your pastor and as one of the spiritual leaders of this faith community, that I needed to know these. That I needed to be sure that what I was saying and what I was doing and how I was leading was aligned with these guiding principles. You know, we've just wrapped a series up on Ephesians, and Paul and many of the Pauline writers wrote those letters to the early churches as a guide and as a blueprint of how they were to be church and how they were to follow in the ways of Jesus long past his death and his resurrection. And our guiding principles are our own letter, our own guide of how we are trying to follow in the ways of Jesus as a faith community. So why are guiding principles important? Guiding principles, in essence, they are the foundation upon which organizations are built. They provide a sense of direction. They foster the type of culture that we are trying to create, and they ensure that an organization stays true to its purpose and its mission and its vision. Our vision at the Congregational Church of San Mateo is to be a strong voice for Christianity, for progressive Christianity on the San Francisco Peninsula and beyond, to build a beloved community and to lead in championing, that is a hard word for me to say, to lead and being champions for social justice for all. So where do these come from? I want to say a special thank you to Phil Lind, our church historian, and Judy Powell and Alexandra Gillen, who all helped with a little research and background on these guiding principles that first appeared in our worship bulletin on May 4th in 2003. So just over 20 years ago. It's 21 years old. They can legally drink. So in 1997, during an interim period, there was in between senior pastors, the church, some of you might remember this, the church went through a visioning process that led to the development of 5 visions for the church. And it is believed that these led to a second and successful effort to become an open and affirming church in 2002. The church affirmed what God has already been up to, what God had affirmed and created in our LGBTQ siblings to lead and love as they are made in the image of God. Those 5 principles, those 5 visions, then led to the writing of these 5 guiding principles by the senior minister at that time, Reverend Dr. Jim Keck. And those principles were Christian, open-minded, spiritual, evolving, and diverse. The original Christian in those guiding principles says, Christian means that we perceive Jesus in the divine qualities of love, peace, joy, and justice. It does not mean that we think Jesus is the only path to God. Christian means we eagerly explore the Bible for its wisdom contained in symbol, metaphor, and history. It doesn't mean a literal or heavy-handed approach that uses the Bible to prove we are right or we are righteous. I like to say that as we take the Bible seriously, not literally. We use the Bible as a tool and not a weapon. Christian means that we have a specific tradition and history to which we are drawn. It doesn't mean that we are constrained from exploring other traditions and creating new ideas that will themselves become history for later generations. Now, you might have noticed that these are a little different. This is a little different than the principle that Frank read earlier in our service, a little longer. And over the years, those 5 original guiding principles have been shortened and expanded and broken up with the leadership of Reverend Dr. Penny Nixon, my predecessor. And then in 2016 and 17, there was a large, inclusive, intentional revisiting of these guiding principles. There were small groups and surveys and feedbacks and forums. Anybody remember those conversations? A few hands, yes. And a lot of intentionality and thought went not just into the wording, but in the order in which they were listed. When Reverend Dr. Cheryl Johnson returned last week, she texted me just to confirm that she was on the right path with her planning, and she said that we're starting with, we're a spiritual community, right? And I said, no, we're starting with, we are Christian. We're going to go through the guiding principles in the order that they're listed. And she's like, oh, okay. I didn't think anything of it. And then I'm walking down to Kloss Hall, and as I'm walking on our loggia, the breezeway, I kind of stop in my tracks and I look, and there are these massive posters. If you're worshiping with us online, and maybe even if you're here, you might not have noticed them. They are this big. They, 3 feet by 2 feet. I don't know, but they're big. And at the top it says, "We are a spiritual community." And I thought, did we print those the wrong way? How did we miss that? So I went and I got one of our welcome brochures from the welcome table, and I looked at it, and on the back where the guiding principles are listed, it said, "We are a spiritual community." And I thought, oh crap. So then I pulled out my phone and I went to our website and I clicked on that welcome button, and you can guess what was on the top of it, right? We are a spiritual community. And that is when I realized that the welcome brochure I was given was an old one. And so I had been looking at these the last 11 months out of order, which is okay. You know, I kind of like, so if you were part of those conversations and you're like, uh-oh, Reverend Jessica is doing these in the wrong order, please know that that was not intentional. It just happened. But, you know, that doesn't really bother me too much. Starting with, we are Christian. I kind of like it. But I understand why we are a spiritual community was listed first. You don't have to be Christian to be part of this community. We are all seekers on different paths, and above all else, we want this to be a place of extravagant welcome, rooted and grounded in love, where all are invited to the table just as Jesus invited everyone. Jews and Greeks, slaves and free, Gentiles and Pharisees, Sadducees, Romans, eunuchs, men, women, young, old, and everyone in between, all are invited by Jesus to experience healing, transformation, and liberation. To be part of building a new type of community, one where everyone has what they need and live with dignity. But for me, when I peel back all of those layers of church and faith and religion, in its simplest form, we are Christian, is what the first line of our guiding principles say. We follow Jesus' example as a way of life and as a way of love. That's it. That is the guide. That is the core principle. That is our purpose. We follow Jesus' example as a way of life and a way of love. Jesus, who said, love your neighbor, love God, love yourself. Jesus, who said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Jesus, who said, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Jesus, who touched a leopard and the sick, and wasn't scared that he would become ill, but he offered healing and assurance that you were not sick because of anything that you had done, and that you don't deserve this disease for any reason. Jesus, who got angry and flipped tables when the temple was being used to exploit the poor and the foreign. Jesus, who led from a place of abundance, not scarcity, showing that when we put our fishes and loaves together, there is more than enough for everyone. Jesus, who had women as part of his inner circle, and first appeared as the risen Christ to the women in the garden, making them the first preachers and leaders of the gospel. Jesus, who said, I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me in. Jesus, who said, remain in my love. You are not servants. You are my friends. Join me in this work. Support one another. Everything I have heard from my Creator, I have made known to you. When you hear that word Christian, do you have a certain type of reaction? Christian. Alvaro just had a reaction, and it wasn't a good one. Maybe you're proud. Maybe you are hesitant. Maybe you're a little embarrassed. Or maybe you're like me, and your first reaction is you want to say, but I'm not that kind of Christian. For a long time, I think I was embarrassed to say that I was a Christian. Because instead of associating Christianity with liberation, people associated it with control. Instead of extravagant welcome, it's associated with hate. Instead of love, it's associated with fear. I resisted being a Christian, identifying as a Christian, because I didn't want anyone to think that I didn't value their faith or their beliefs, or that I thought that my path was the only path to experience the divine. I remember the summer of 2011 well. It was the hottest summer on record in the state of Texas. I almost moved then. But it was also the summer that I took a religious diversity class with Dr. Nam Soon Kong. And it was in that class that I realized that claiming the identifier of Christian didn't mean that I didn't value or respect others' beliefs and traditions. It simply meant that for me, following Jesus' example as a way of life and a way of love was how I chose to live. Because of who I was, because of my experiences, my journey, my understanding of God's love breaking into our world once again in Jesus the Christ, to not just show us how to live, but to give us hope that this world and our own lives can be transformed and restored to wholeness, and to show us how to do that. I would seek to answer that call, to follow that way every single day of my life. Now, my understanding of what that looks like has changed. My understanding of what it means to be Christian is different than it was 10 years ago. It's different than what Alvaro's is. It's different than what your understanding of Christian is. And that, my friends, is a sacred gift. Because here at CCSM, part of saying we are Christian means we are committed to exploring what that means together. It doesn't mean that we have all the answers. It doesn't mean that we claim to be right, but it means that we are seeking to let love be our guide. It's so easy to say what Christianity isn't, or what our church isn't. But when we do that, we get dangerously close to judging our neighbor. And so, instead, in this worship series, let's explore and name what we are. We are Christian. We are a spiritual community. We are God's hands and feet and face. We are inclusive. We are open-minded. And we are evolving. This is how we practice our faith. This is how we answer Jesus' call to love. Jesus invited us into this holy friendship of exploration. So as we embark on this worship series of exploring our guiding principles, I challenge you, I challenge us to pay attention to where God is still speaking and how God is still inviting us to change and to transform and to be disruptors for love in this season of life as the Congregational Church of San Mateo. May it be so. Amen.